Is a 2018 HP Envy laptop still usable at 7 years old? Let's find out. Welcome to S Computers, I'm Scott, and today on the Desk of Esk we're going to try and talk ourselves out of buying a new laptop. While I love technology and would gladly use the most powerful hardware available, I'm not made of money, and I'm not yet Gamers Tips Unboxed, so no one's sending me any freebies. I've learned instead to find joy in the budget side of the market, and for my own purchases, using them until they either fall apart and can't be fixed, or no longer do what I need it to do. Which brings me to my laptop, a venerable 13-inch HP Envy x360 from 2018, powered by a Ryzen 5 2500U processor. HP's calling this 13-AG0502SA, but I call it Banshee because all my personal computers are named after StarCraft units, because I am a colossal nerd. While I'm at my desktop PC the vast majority of the time, I do like to have a laptop that can handle everything that I need to do with it, even if it's mostly sat on the shelf. I guess I'm a sort of tech version of a prepper. Now I've apparently added video production to the list of things that I do, I suppose it's time to reassess how it's holding up as we head into 2026. Before we get into poking at its limits, let's go over what it is. As mentioned earlier, it has a 13.3-inch 1080p screen that's still pretty nice for being 7 years old. Reviews of the time say its colours cover 89% of the sRGB range, its contrast is 1100:1, and it reaches 225 nits of brightness from HP's claim of 250 nits. This means it's okay, but not perfect for work such as colour collecting photos and videos, and viewing films and whatnot. Its response times of 30 milliseconds grey to grey is on the slow side for gaming according to thatgadgetguy.com.au, but I'll be the judge of that later on. The party trick of the x360 line is that the screen is able to fold all the way back on itself, turning it into a sort of tablet, and indeed any point in between, so it can be used in this tent type format. To be honest, I don't think I've ever used this tent formation and I don't really see what benefit it has over normal laptop ergonomics. It seems like the tablet format would be more useful, but even at a not unreasonable 1.3 kilos, this is just too heavy to be wielded like an iPad. It's nice to have, but not all that useful. What might be an unintended consequence is that this overachieving hinge design has held up pretty well, and given that most people think that HP stands for hinge problems, I'm going to take this as a win. The processor is the AMD Ryzen 5 2500U, a 15-watt 4-core 8-thread part with a 2 GHz base frequency and up to 3.6 GHz burst frequency. It comes with an unupgradable 8 gigs of DDR4 2400, and this has a 256GB SSD. All of these feel a little bit lacking in the here and now, and certainly the RAM and storage weren't overly generous back in 2018. SSD speeds are solid at 2205 megabits per second read and 1271 write. I picked this up for £380 in 2019 second-hand from eBay. I think a decent price at the time, although it did have a few dents in the corner as you can see here. Looking at the ports while we're here, there's a USB Type-C 3.1 Gen 1 port that can be used for charging as well as display out with a suitable dongle, 2 USB-A 3.1 Gen 1 ports, a combo headphone microphone jack, a barrel power plug if you'd rather use that, and a micro SD media card reader that I wish was full-sized, but such is life. No Ethernet is a bit of a pain, but HP will happily sell you this USB dongle if you aren't satisfied with relying on the built-in AC Wi-Fi, which also handles Bluetooth 4.2 duties. Apparently it shipped with a USB-C to HDMI dongle, but I didn't receive that with mine, so I'm using a Dell USB-C dock for HDMI out to my garbage tier cheapo video capture dongle. Overall, I think it's a pleasing design that's held up quite well. Physically, it's about 31 by 21 centimeters and 1.5 centimeters at its thickest. The speakers have a Bang & Olufsen branding, and were probably above average for laptop speakers of the era, but that's more of an indictment of laptop speakers in general. In truth, they aren't amazing. They lack much in the way of bass, so while they're fine for casual YouTube viewing, for most movies, games or music, you'd be better served with a headset. Judge for yourself with this ISO standard computer speaker test. The webcam and mic are, well, judge for yourself as you are watching and listening to them right now. Serviceable is what I'd go with, although I do really like the Windows Hello IR camera and how streamlined and terrifying that makes logging in. This has a chiclet style backlit keyboard that I find comfortable to type on, and there's not much of any flex to it, so nothing to complain about here. The trackpad is sufficient. It could have done with stealing the larger footprint Mac design, and it's certainly not state of the art now, let alone at the time. It's fine for office work and web browsing, but a bit cramped and inaccurate for serious graphic work. One optional extra I've gone for which should help with this is the HP Tilt Pen, which is a pretty good stylus as far as I can tell. I'm no artist, but it has a supremely annoying design issue in as much as it's really awful at holding it a charge when it's not being used. This means that without fail when you reach for it, it's dead and needs charging, so I wound up barely using it. Most irritating. HP shipped the x360 with Windows 10, which was perfectly acceptable to me until one day it simply stopped booting. As it was coming to the end of support, I switched to Ubuntu Linux for a year, which worked pretty well, but I want to use the same apps on my desktop and laptop, and I could not find a replacement cross-platform photo app that I liked as much as On1 Photo for Windows. So I've hacked on a Windows 11 Internet of Things edition, a move of dubious legality, but it's a really good stripped-back and efficient version of Windows that doesn't try and cram AI down your throat every turn. I'm sure Microsoft will look to crack down on this soon, but I'll enjoy it while it lasts. This has a 53 watt battery that HP claimed under a very specific set of circumstances would last for 11 hours and play video for 7.5. It's hard to think of this as anything other than a lie, even with a fresh battery. My degraded 7-year-old one gives about 2 hours when watching YouTube and a smidgen less when processing and editing photos, so it can't be away from the wall for very long. Let's do some performance testing. I'm not going to compare this with modern laptops because, well, I don't have one. Also, because it would be a bloodbath, and it's not what I want to find out. I'm looking at whether what I've got fits my current needs. Much as I'd like to pretend that I'm always busy productively battering away at creative or office tasks, I'm most likely to be sat watching YouTube. It handles 1080p streaming video absolutely fine, no matter the source. In fact, web browsing in general is absolutely fine. I would of course recommend use of Firefox and an ad blocker to everyone, for a variety of reasons. It also speeds up the browsing experience greatly while helping to protect your privacy. I've not had to do anything more complicated in Office apps than a simple letter or some very basic tracking spreadsheets, so it can handle all that fine in any of Microsoft Office, LibreOffice or Google Docs. For writing scripts like this one, I'm using plain text in Google Keep, so that could be managed by practically any computer made this millennium. As mentioned earlier, I like to use On1 Photo. While obviously a 9800 X3D system is much faster at everything in general, the experience on the x360 is acceptable. Here's me doing the usual fairly light edits to a Panasonic RAW photo, a bit of levelling and cropping, a bit of exposure and colour correcting, checking the lens correction, a bit of denoising, which I think is as computationally difficult as it gets, and the final export. Not blazing fast, but it's not frustrating enough to make me want to lay out money on a new laptop. If anything's a pain compared to working on my desktop, it's the lack of screen space compared to a honking great widescreen monitor, but that's not a problem inherent to this machine. I also on occasion use Affinity's suite of photo and design apps, I suppose mainly these days for video thumbnails. Nothing too complex, just really adding some text overlays, so here's that being done. No issues with that for my simple cases. I've not recorded a podcast in a few years now, but I used to, and from previous experience I can tell you there's no problem recording podcast audio in Audacity while chatting on Discord and then editing the participants' tracks together in Reaper. Applying any compression and intro music and audio strings is easily done, with the only real difference from my desktop being a few minutes longer export time for the longer episodes. I can live with that. Now I do want to have the capacity for a bit of gaming for any downtime. There's two drawbacks here. The 256GB SSD is barely big enough for some of today's games, which is solved by the other drawback: the integrated Vega 8 graphics aren't powerful enough to run them. After all, at a 15W TDP for the combined CPU and GPU, it's got maybe 3 to 5% of the raw horsepower of the systems that we've been looking at recently. Still, seeing as I have a suite of test games from previous videos on an external SSD, I suppose we can quickly run through them and see if we get anything playable from the demanding end before looking at something a bit more realistic. Cinebench 2024 aborts its run due to a lack of RAM, so that's not a great start. It's also not a game, so that's fine. Speaking of not games, here's the rest of the usual synthetic tests. 3D Mark's Time Spy gets a whopping 818 points, Firestrike screams its way to a blistering 2149, and Unigine superposition at 1080p high settings gets us a stratospheric 971. Shadow of the Tomb Raider takes quite a while to load, and our usual benchmark on it, 1080p high settings, gives an average of 8 frames per second, and at 720p lower settings it still wasn't playable at 23 frames per second average. Counter-Strike 2 gets a very jerky 13 average FPS at 1080p very high, although 720p low settings gives us a reasonably playable 55 average FPS. Cyberpunk 2077 at our usual 1080p ultra settings gives us a PowerPoint-esque 4 frames per second, and 720p low settings isn't much better at 14 average FPS. Call of Duty Warzone crashes through desktop in fairly spectacular fashion, as did Assassin's Creed Mirage at 1080p high settings, with 720p low settings getting an average of 22 frames per second. Unreal Engine 5 games are simply not happening. Black Myth Wukong gets 4 FPS at 1080p high without framegen, and at 720p low with framegen and 67% FSR scaling, it scrabbles its way to a still unacceptable 21 average frames per second. Marvel Rivals at the usual 1080p medium native revs gives a whole 2 frames per second, and even at 720p low performance settings and a bunch of FSR, we're still stuck at 13 frames per second. Red Dead Redemption 2, as with most of these games so far, warns us about low memory at launch, and at 720p low settings it gets us an 18 frames per second average. It's even a bridge too far for the highly optimised Forza Horizon 5, getting 12 FPS at 1080p medium settings, improving to 29 FPS at 720p lowest settings, and Horizon Zero Dawn, at a barely recognisable 480p lowest settings, stuttered its way to 18 frames per second average. So, if that's a bit of a bust, what can I play instead? Well, my backlog of games goes back to before the advent of Steam, so there's no shortage of less demanding games on my to-play list that this can handle. For example, any 2D game that I can think of, so the likes of Hollow Knight and its platformer brethren like Dead Cells, indie Harvest Moon killer Stardew Valley, gorgeous Golden Era animation-themed run-and-gun Cuphead, addictive card battler roguelike Slay the Spire, colony/failure sim Rimworld, and so many others run very well. Hell, Rimworld and the other addictive card battler roguelike Balatro alone could consume my entire life, so we're not hurting for entertainment. That's not to say 3D games aren't beyond it if you calibrate your expectations. Going back in time to the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era, we can easily run games like perhaps my favourite RPG, Fallout New Vegas, the most profitable game of all time, Grand Theft Auto 5, the last outing of the sadly missed Max Payne 3, perhaps my favourite RPG, Skyrim, one of the best fighters in Ultra Street Fighter 4, the amazing Nepo Baby vigilante simulator Batman Arkham City, and perhaps my favourite RPG, Mass Effect, all run very well. Of course, there's also a near infinite raft of PC games going way back to the MS-DOS era that can be mostly persuaded to play by some means, either natively or using the excellent Exodus project to get hold of classics like Wing Commander or TIE Fighter. I'm told non-space combat games are also available. It's not just PC games on the menu, of course, there's plenty of console games that can be played through emulation. As with PC games, the 2D era won't be a problem, so the 8 and 16-bit consoles from the Atari 2600 all the way through to the Neo Geo are going to run perfectly. Stepping into 3D, the OG PlayStation and the N64 are easily dealt with. Sega's Dreamcast might just be my favourite console, and seems oddly easy to emulate given how good I think this still looks. The most demanding games like Metropolis Street Racer and Shenmue 2 look amazing still, and there's so many classic arcade experiences to experience on this console. My other contender for favourite console would be the Sega Saturn, whose unique hardware is troublesome to emulate, so the likes of Panzergoon Saga and Burning Rangers are a bit of a stretch, but they can be playable. I did not have a Nintendo GameCube at the time, so I do want to catch up with the likes of Metroid Prime and Rogue Squadron 2, Rogue Leader, and these harder to run games play variably on this laptop. Metroid seems fine, but Rogue Leader stutters quite badly. Less demanding games of course will run fine. But that might be as far as we can reliably push it though. Trying to get some of the more demanding PlayStation 2 games gives a similar experience to the GameCube. God of War 2 actually runs pretty well, but Shadow of the Colossus doesn't give a very good experience at all, so less demanding games will run fine, but it's a bit variable. PlayStation 3 and the assorted Xboxes are beyond it. But onto what prompted this video, namely videos and the editing thereof. Looking at the minimum specs for DaVinci Resolve 20 on their website, it just says Windows 10 Creators Update. No hardware. And I have some hardware, so that must be fine, right? Other websites suggest 16 gigs of RAM and a proper video card, so that's less promising. Thankfully I'm only recording and editing in 1080p, so at least there's an outside chance of this working. If I ever jump to 4K I do not expect this to cut it. Even at 1080p it's best to use proxy clips, downsampled easier to handle clips for editing, that are then replaced with the full quality clips for the final export. Running through my fairly light use case of stitching together the clips, background music and simple titles, there's a few problems but I can work around them. On my main PC I can simply dump the 80-odd gigabytes of raw footage into Resolve's media bin and then preview, pick and insert without any problems. Attempting to front load that on this laptop causes it to be unresponsive, I assume from the workload of trying to create all those proxy clips at once. Adding the necessary files as I need them and doing the previewing externally in the VLC video player app outside of Resolve is working, but it's a slower and less convenient workflow. It also wasn't recognising videos from my Pixel phone, but that's my mistake in not installing the HEVC codec pack, which turned out to be a saga in itself as I don't have the Microsoft Store installed in this stripped back IoT Windows edition, which means that the app installer for MSIX and Apex bundle format installers was not installed. Nothing a bit of googling couldn't solve, and after installing the installer for the installer I could install the codecs. With that fixed, the playback of the clips during editing was a little choppy, but never unbearably so. On 2 occasions it didn't load a clip correctly, requiring a restart to fix, but overall the main barriers to being as productive as I could be on my desktop was a more cramped screen and a slightly worse mouse, so at least for my current amateurish basic editing style, this laptop can handle it. The final render to the 1080p YouTube setting took 24 minutes and 11 seconds, quite a while for a 10-ish minute video and much longer than the 1 minute 33 seconds that my desktop takes to render the same project, but I'm only doing this once a week so I can live with that. If nothing else, it's a useful incentive to double check your work before rendering. So, it's good news for my overdraft. There's no pressing need to upgrade my laptop at this precise moment. Sure, it can't play the most demanding games, but there's plenty of older games that it can, and that's the only area that it can't really cope with acceptably. If I was making my living editing photos, or particularly video, I'd want something faster as my daily driver. If I keep this YouTube lark up and learn any more demanding techniques or effect, or move to 4K video, then this will go past what this guy can offer. But I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Overall, this is still doing what what I need it to do, and I'm still quite happy with it. I just need this to be able to handle the same duties as my main desktop, not match it for speed. Faster processors, better graphics capabilities, OLED screens, just better hardware in general has of course become available in the 7 years since it's launched, and as much as I like it, can't justify it. At least not yet. And if there's any point to the past quarter hour of waffling, it's simply that you do not need to be on the bleeding edge of hardware to get serious work done and have a decent time playing too. I've not searched extensively on eBay, but these seem to be going for around £150 for a good condition example. I don't know if that's the best deal available, but I think it's a decent value and would be better than a new machine that you could buy at that same price point. I'm not suggesting you make this your first choice when looking for a laptop, but it's certainly meeting my needs quite well, and I'm still very happy with it. If you have any thoughts on this video, then please post a comment down below, and if you've enjoyed this, then please consider subscribing. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.